type students in our classrooms, which presents its own challenges. We've technology all around us, and I suppose we struggle then to figure out how we use that, and we've just seen obviously a really good innovation around using technology for teaching. But the students also kind of have access to technology, although personally I'm not sure how techie they are. They're good on social media and so on, but not necessarily techie. And I suppose we've seen the types of changing funding models in the third level sector, which means our funding is being cut. We're encouraged to create different modules that are, or at least different courses that are paid, particularly at postgraduate level. There is a drive to have more and more international students that are paying high non-EU fees, potentially to bring in funding into the university, which all means we've ended up with very, very large, very diverse classes. So it's difficult then to, I suppose, encourage students to be motivated to try and get to those critical thinking type skills and the kind of skills that we want to instill but are very hard to do if we're faced with these diverse classes and this massification kind of era. And getting students to engage is difficult. So that's the sort of general context that we all face. But I think in tax we have particularly challenges that are specific to tax because it changes every year for us. So I sometimes am very jealous of colleagues who kind of can trot out the same case study every year, or whatever it is, where you think, God, even students say, well, can I have access to the past exam questions? And I'm saying, well, yeah, but if I give you solutions, I have to update every solution every year for the credits, for the rates, and so on. And because we all have specific jurisdictional rules, I know Andy produces a textbook here, but in Ireland, the Institute of Tax are the only ones who produce a textbook because you have to update it every year. It's a small market, so we just don't have access to this sort of material. So I think there are extra challenges that we have potentially in tax over and above the normal challenges. So I came across this concept of co-creation at an education conference a couple of years ago. And it's not anything very new, but the term, I suppose, is a little bit new maybe. And it's around staff and students working together to kind of co-create content. So to have the students involved in that partnership type way, so that you're both taking responsibility for achieving learning outcomes, not just the lecturer kind of taking all the responsibility. And it was a particular keynote presentation that talked about this, and what this guy had done was he had gone around to various different institutions all around the world and gathered examples of how this was being done. And it can go from students actually creating their own courses to creating modules, to helping teach on the module, to being involved in assessment and so on. So it can be taken at a very high level or a very, very low, small level. So he had examples of all that kind of stuff. So I kind of thought, oh, that looks interesting. I'll have a look at some of those examples and see, is there anything I can do in my own teaching, even in a small way, to kind of sort of bring this co-creation concept into my own teaching. So what the advocates of co-creation would say that is, if students are involved in helping to generate content themselves, however that might manifest itself, that kind of achieves much deeper learning than just having to learn by rote stuff that is being presented to them. And that they are more inclined to be motivated because they're involved, and that leads to enhanced conceptual understanding. So that's sort of what the advocates of this idea would say. And in particular, the piece that caught my attention was students creating the questions rather than just answering questions. And I went, ding, here I can have students actually help out with creating some of the content that we struggle, I suppose, every year to have to update. So that's sort of how it came about. So I suppose the underlying theory of this is constructivism, which I won't really go into, but it's really just about active learning. So students actively engaging and having to be active rather than passive in terms of their education. So there's some material in the paper about constructivism if people want to look at the underlying theory. But I suppose what the literature on co-creation advocates is that it enhances student engagement in their own educational experience, and that they're definitely more motivated in terms of their learning. So that's what the kind of stuff that's coming out of the literature so far. It enhances their metacognitive awareness and gives them a stronger sense of identity in terms of their own learning. It also enhances the teaching and classroom experiences because it can be something different. So a bit like the VR thing. I think anything that's new, students kind of like it. It creates a little bit more of a better experience and enhances the relationships between staff and students. And it helps with the development of a wide range of graduate attributes. So that's what the literature kind of is tentatively saying in terms of the benefits of co-creation. But there hasn't been a huge amount of this done really in the higher education sector. So there isn't that many examples of it being done, and certainly very few examples of students being involved in co-creating assessment. And I suppose one of the issues that we would have in accounting and tax is that I suppose because our modules are often linked with the professional exams and exemptions, we would probably have a bit of an issue with students being involved in assessment because to some degree we have to kind of account for how we assess students to the professional bodies. So in that sense, I wasn't going to hand over the entire assessment mechanism to the students. So that's the kind of idea, I suppose, of co-creation. So multiple choice questions, then if we just look at the idea of multiple choice questions, we use them all the time, particularly in these large diverse classes, because they allow us to assess a range of material. They're quick, they're easy, we can mark them online. The real bottlenecks are the creation of the MCQ banks. And also, I suppose, the idea that it's a recognition task rather than a kind of a generation task. So, students can be quite smart at saying, oh, that's definitely wrong, that might be, it's not really having them write on a topic in the same way. So there's the sort of downsides, but there are a lot of upsides, and I don't know about your institutions, but certainly first year accounting, where we have 700 or 800 students, a portion of the exam is almost multiple choice just because of the grading and being able to, I suppose, assess a wide range of what's on the curriculum. So we love MCQs and we don't like MCQs. But when you think about actually creating an MCQ, it's a far more cognitively demanding task to actually create one. So you have to know the topic well. You have to, I suppose, articulate the STEM unambiguously. Ideally, the distractors or the incorrect answer that you list, if you're being clever about it, should actually encapsulate some of the common misconceptions. So you actually have to really understand the topic to be able to do that. So that's a much more challenging task, and it gets over the whole idea of it being a recognition task if students actually have to create these, and then you also end up with this database of questions which can be used. So this caught my attention. Obviously it was all about the students, but it was also pragmatically a good idea, I thought, to be able to generate this amount of kind of content. So the literature is kind of cautiously optimistic on this. When you look at the literature, leaving aside the general co-creation literature and just looking at the literature on students authoring MCQs, and this is not new. People have probably been doing this for decades, but the co-creation tag is a little bit sort of a buzzword, I suppose, and it's been brought in under this. So the literature on students generating their own multiple choice questions, typically, a lot of the studies in this area have looked at the level of questions and the quality of questions that students have generated, and found generally they actually produce really good questions. So some of the papers in this area will actually look at Bloom's taxonomy and link the level of questions and rank them in terms of Bloom's taxonomy. And they've generally found that the students create quite good questions. They usually produce more questions than are required by whatever the course requires them to do. Some studies have also looked at how students perceive this, whether they like it, and again, generally, they quite like it because it gives them a bit of sort of autonomy. It's something a little bit creative, and in some of the studies, the researchers have then promised the students, well, if all of you create an MCQ, I'll put a certain number of them on the exam. So they kind of feel like they're getting an input or an impact that way. But what was lacking when we looked at the literature is, does it actually make sense in terms of actually helping them to learn, and what is the impact on academic performance and the achievement of learning outcomes? So there was nothing really that looked at that. So that's what we were interested in. Sorry, there were studies that looked at it, but we felt not in a very robust way. So there was a few studies that looked at this, and yeah, I'll tell you what they did, and then you can judge. There's a group of studies that used pre and post tests. So So they would give the students 45 MCQs at the beginning of the semester. Then they would teach the subject and then have the students write an MCQ or more than one. And then they would give them the same 45 MCQ questions at the end and then say, wow, they learned something. And I thought, well, of course they did. They did a whole module of lectures and tutorials. And also you're giving them the same MCQ questions again. So even if, and in fact, some of those studies term things funnily in the sense that they say, this did not have a detrimental impact on their learning. And you're thinking, that's a weird way of even terming it. So again, I was kind of looking to, surely there has to be a better way of measuring this. Another group of studies would put the MCQs that the students generated onto, or some of them onto the exam question. So they would say, if there's 200 generated, 10 of them will go onto the exam. But obviously what the students then would do is they'd practice all of them. And if they did better at the end, it may have just been because they had practiced all the questions, not necessarily that they understood the topic better, in my view. So again, I was kind of thinking, well, that's nice, but not really, there isn't really a cause and effect there. There's a number of studies that use a peer-wise online platform for this, which I'm going to talk about in a little while. And some of the studies have looked at how engaged the students are on peer-wise, so their level of engagement, the number of times they've logged on and so on, and then linked that to academic performance and found if students engage more in peer-wise, they did better. But again, there's a whole self-selection going on there that doesn't really prove any cause and effect. And then there's a final group of 3 studies that did actually use control groups. So they would have a group of students that generated MCQs on the topic, and then another group that didn't. But again, they tested them pre and post using MCQs and found, in some cases, well, they all did the same. So again, and again, there is an issue with control groups from research ethics perspectives, which kind of make it tricky to use control groups in education type research. So when we looked at it, we thought, well, none of those studies actually robustly measure whether students creating their own MCQs in tax actually it does any good. So we had already done a study last year, on the first time we did this, and what we did, similar to what you guys did with the VR, is we looked at students' perceptions. So we did a survey, and they really liked it, so that was fine. But this time we were saying, well, we really want to see if it actually is having an impact on achievement of learning outcomes. Okay, so as I said, all of the studies that we had looked at just didn't really allow us to disentangle the impact of engaging with co-creation in this way with the achievement of learning outcomes without kind of confusing it with all of the other stuff that's going on simultaneously, like lectures and tutorials and so on. So in our view, the effect of MCQ co-creation on academic performance hadn't really been strongly evidenced to date. So that's where we kind of started from. So that was our research focus, was to actually examine whether students do better, so they learn better. And I should say we were using academic achievement in the exam as a proxy for learning, which may have its own problems, but that was as close as we could get. And we're using an online peer learning environment to look at the generation of the MCQ. So that was kind of our aim. So what we did was we introduced, I have a 3rd year undergraduate tax module. There are accounting and finance majors on a business studies degree, and then I also have law and accounting students in there and a couple of international business students. So there was 240 students in the 3rd year undergrad module. So one of the things they talk about co-creation is that you should start small on this. So I said, fine, this is going to be a 5% assignment only. And the students were required to generate 1 multiple choice question and answer 3 of their classmates' questions. And we used Peerwise as a platform. The first time we did this, we didn't use Peerwise. I know the students emailed me all of their multiple choice questions, and I, being a complete control freak, then had to fix them all. I had to put them all in the same font, and I wanted them all to look nice. And the idea was that these would be made available to the whole class. So the next time that we did this last year, we used this Peerwise platform, which is available through the University in Auckland. If you contact them, they'll just set you up on it. It's a free online platform. So the idea is the students would write 1 question and answer 3. And once they can upload their question using Peerwise once they kind of register, and then it appears in a nice way. They put in the stem and the distractors. They have to have a whole worked out solution as well with workings. But then they can follow each other on this platform. They can like somebody else's question. They can make comments. And typically what they've found again in the literature is if there's mistakes in the questions, other students would pick them up and often make a comment, and then it gives the students a chance to kind of correct them. So it's kind of like a sort of any of these online, the functionality of any of these online platforms. So the idea was that then the whole question bank is obviously available to all of the students. So I had given them deadlines. I got them to focus on 5 different topics, and the topic was assigned to them. So they had to do it on capital allowances as one, termination payments was another, BIK was another. So there was 5 topics. And I would give them the deadline to have the MCQ completed about a week and a half after the topic was covered in class. So the idea was that all of those questions went up a couple of days after the topic was covered in class. So the whole class then had those available as a learning resource. So one of 5 distinct topics, so they were given the topic they had to do it on and the deadline. And the way we set this up, and it's not really novel to do this as a project in itself, but I think the novelty for us was to try and measure the impact. So we took the 5 topics. They each had to do an MCQ on one of those topics. Then we had a compulsory exam question in the final exam, which had 5 distinct parts that matched each of those topics. But they weren't MCQs, they were short questions, okay? So every student had to do all 5, but obviously they've only done an MCQ on one of those, which allowed us almost to have a control and an experimental group without actually having any student not complete this. But they'd obviously only done the MCQ on one of the topics. So I suppose the idea was that if the co-creation of the multiple choice question was effective in terms of allowing them to learn that topic or facilitating them learning that topic more deeply, then they should do better in the part of the question that linked with the bit that they had done the MCQ on. Does that make sense? Okay, so that was the idea. So we thought that was a better way of testing the effectiveness on this than any other of the studies that we had seen in this area. So our findings, well, it was very basic in terms of the stats, just a paired sample t-test, and we did find. Now, my colleague on the co-author on the paper was the one who did the stats, and what he did was rather than just taking their actual mark in the final exam, he did a standard deviation from the mean in order just to it's a stats thing, I'm not good on this stuff, but in order to ensure that if any of the individual parts were slightly more difficult than the next, he was actually taking the average mark and their variation from the average mark. So it just added a bit of robustness to it. And we found that there was a statistically significant difference in how they performed in the part of the question that they had done the MCQ on versus all the others. And it was sort of to a reasonably significant impact. That was the P-score there. Okay, so that's kind of it. I mean, what we reckon is that, again, as I say, the assignment itself is not that novel, but we felt how we measured the effectiveness of it was a little bit more robust than had been done in previous studies. The previous paper we did on this looked at their perceptions and they loved it, so that was sort of a nice starter. But this hopefully proves that it actually did have an impact on their learning. This is obviously only one type of co-creation and a very small part of co-creation. So our idea for going forward is, for this semester, which I'll start teaching tomorrow, is to have this assignment, but also have the students create a video explaining a tax concept and upload a 3-minute video. So again, all those videos become content that all the students can use. We're hoping to get some sponsorship so that the good videos maybe would get a prize and so on. And then try and measure impact. So did the MCQ creation, which is a bit dry maybe, versus the video creation, do they have different impacts? So I suppose that we hope that the paper kind of provides an experiment that tests more robustly the impact of co-creation in this way, and also kind of gives a case study for how we did it in a tax context. It's scalable because of the online platform. So because the students just upload their questions, by the end of the semester I can go in and I can look at all the metrics, how often they engaged, how often they logged on, all that kind of usual stuff. So that's useful. You obviously have to mark the MCQ, but there are other studies that have looked at the students' kind of peer marking and peer assessing and all that kind of stuff. So it's quite scalable in that way. And then you have this bank of MCQs created that you can use, or you can use for future reference, or the students can use. So that's it. It's not overly complicated, but hopefully it might be something that you could think about using. I know my colleagues in accounting have said, oh, I couldn't really tell that the students weren't plagiarising questions because they've got banks and banks and banks of questions available, normally, you know, associated with the textbook and so on in, say, management accounting. Whereas in tax, I think, because things change on a regular basis, it's more difficult for students to find up-to-date questions. And if they find a question that's 10 years old and they update it, I'm going, well, you know, that's okay in some ways if they understand the topic. So, thank you.